The night Nora discovered she was pregnant, the entire family was overjoyed. After 8 long years of waiting, prayers, and tears, God had finally blessed her with the miracle they had all been hoping for. It was her first pregnancy. Her home was unmatched. Everyone hugged her, her husband John couldn't stop smiling, and her heart was filled with hope and gratitude. Later that night, as Nora lay on her bed, she gently placed her hands on her tummy and whispered, "Thank you, God." Feeling a sense of peace, she slowly drifted to sleep. But her sleep was not peaceful for long. In her dream, she found herself lying on the cold floor of a restroom. Her legs were spread open, and she could see someone kneeling between them. As her eyes focused, she froze in shock. It was her stepmother, Agatha. Agatha's face looked calm but strangely determined as she pushed her hands deep into Nora's body, reaching for her womb. Nora screamed in pain, tears streaming down her face, begging Agatha to stop. But Agatha kept pulling out tiny babies from her womb, flushing them down the toilet one by one. The sound of the flushing echoed in her ears, filling her with dread. "No! Please stop!" Nora cried out in her dream. But Agatha didn't stop. The pain was unbearable, and Nora screamed louder, trying to fight back. Suddenly, she woke up with a start, her body shaking and her heart racing. "It was just a dream," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. But as she looked down, she froze in terror. Her bedsheets were soaked in blood. "No, no, no!" she screamed, clutching her stomach. "God, please don't let this be real. Please, no!" Her screams woke John, who rushed to her side. The sight of the blood drained the color from his face. Without wasting a second, he scooped her up and rushed her to the hospital. But it was too late. The doctors delivered the devastating news. She had miscarried. Nora's world shattered. She and John cried together in the hospital room, their dreams crumbling after years of waiting and hoping. The next day, still grieving, Nora packed a small bag and decided to visit her mother. She needed comfort, someone who would understand the depth of her pain. As she walked into her father's house, she passed her stepmother, Agatha, in the hallway. For a moment, she froze, unsure whether to speak to her or walk past. Was the dream just a nightmare? Or did Agatha have something to do with this? Before Nora could decide, Agatha walked up to her with open arms and hugged her tightly. "My child, welcome home," she said warmly. Nora stiffened in her embrace, her face cold and unwelcoming. "And thank you," she muttered, quickly stepping back. Agatha studied her with a worried expression. "Are you okay? You don't look happy. You look tired," she said, her voice filled with concern. "I'm fine," Nora replied curtly, avoiding eye contact. "Let me go see my mom." She walked away, leaving Agatha standing in the hallway, confused. In her mother's room, Nora couldn't hold it in any longer. She fell to her knees beside her mother, tears streaming down her face. "Nora, what's wrong? You're scaring me!" her mother exclaimed, rushing to her side. Through her sobs, Nora managed to say, "I lost the pregnancy, Mom. I lost it." Her mother gasped, holding her tightly. "Oh, my child, I'm so sorry," she whispered. Nora explained everything, the dream, the bleeding, and her suspicions about Agatha. "Mom, I think Agatha has a hand in this," she said, her voice trembling. But her mother quickly interrupted her. "No, my child, don't think like that. Sometimes the devil can use the faces of people we love in dreams to create confusion and mistrust. Agatha has been good to us since the day your father married her. Even when she didn't have children of her own, she treated you and your siblings like her own. I don't believe she would hurt you." "But Mom," Nora began, but her mother shook her head gently. "Listen, my child, let's keep praying and trusting God. The one who will stay will come. This is not the end. Hold on to your faith," her mother said, stroking her hair. Nora nodded through her tears, but the doubt in her heart remained. As her mother held her, she silently wondered if she could ever trust Agatha again. Agatha's knock on the door interrupted their emotional conversation. "Mama Nora, is everything okay?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. Mama Nora stepped out to meet her, closing the door gently behind her. She explained everything, the dream, the bleeding, and the devastating loss of the pregnancy. Agatha's face turned pale as tears welled up in her eyes. "God forbid me hurting my own!" Agatha exclaimed, her voice trembling with emotion. "I would never harm Nora or anyone in this family." Mama Nora placed a hand on her shoulder. I know, Agatha. I believe this is the devil trying to break the peace we've always had in this family. Agatha nodded and then said thoughtfully, There's a place I know, a prophetess. She's a powerful woman of God and she knows how to deal with spiritual issues. We should go to her. She can help us. Nora and her mother exchanged a glance. Though they were hesitant, they trusted Agatha. Together, they decided to visit the prophetess in hopes of finding answers and peace. The journey to the prophetess's place was long and eerie. They traveled to a small village, walking along a narrow path that led to a hillside near a dark, winding river. The valley was surrounded by tall, shadowy hills, and the air felt heavy, almost as if it carried secrets no one dared to speak of. When they arrived, the prophetess was waiting for them. She was an older woman with a wise and weathered face, wearing a long, flowing robe. Her piercing eyes seemed to look straight into Nora's soul, as if she already knew everything that had happened. She nodded silently and gestured for them to sit. Nora clutched her mother's hand tightly, feeling uneasy as the prophetess closed her eyes and began to pray. Her voice was steady and commanding, filling the small room with a powerful presence. The candles flickered, casting strange, dancing shadows on the walls. Nora felt a chill run down her spine, and her grip on her mother's hand tightened. She wanted to run, but something about the prophetess kept her rooted in place. After what felt like an eternity, the prophetess opened her eyes and spoke softly, her voice filled with mystery. Nora, she said, you are being followed by a powerful water spirit. This spirit comes from the deep waters and has been connected to you since before you were born. It is causing these strange events in your life, and we must perform a special prayer to break its hold over you. Mama Nora's face turned pale as she held Nora's hand tighter. Please, do whatever you must to help my daughter, she pleaded. The prophetess shook her head slowly. This cannot be done without her husband's presence, she said. You must return in the morning with him. Bring something from Nora's childhood, preferably a piece of her baby clothing. Tonight, however, we must begin the first prayer. Only I and her stepmother can perform it. Nora will stay here with us. Do not worry. She will be safe. Mama Nora hesitated, her heart heavy with worry. She didn't want to leave her daughter behind, but she had no choice. She held Nora's hand and whispered, Be brave, my child. I'll be back in the morning with John. Trust God, and trust these women to help you. As her mother left, Nora felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. She sat quietly as the prophetess began preparing for the night. She lit candles and sprinkled water around the room, murmuring prayers under her breath. The flickering candlelight cast eerie shadows on the walls, making the room feel mysterious and slightly spooky. Agatha stayed by Nora's side, holding her hand and whispering words of comfort. Don't be afraid, my child. We are here to help you. But as the night deepened and the air grew colder, Nora couldn't shake the feeling that something extraordinary and terrifying was about to happen. Late that night, when the world was silent and still, the prophetess called Nora. The small room was dimly lit, with candles flickering and casting strange, dancing shadows on the walls. The air felt heavy, as if the room held secrets too big for words. The only sound was the prophetess's soft yet commanding voice. Nora, come here, the prophetess said, her eyes gleaming in the candlelight. She handed Nora a long white cloth. Tie this around your chest and over your head. Nora held the cloth in her trembling hands, feeling its cool texture against her skin. Her heart raced as she tied it around herself, following the prophetess's instructions. She looked around the room, feeling nervous but also a small flicker of hope. Maybe this is it, she thought. Maybe this will end all my troubles. The prophetess began praying again, her voice rising and echoing off the walls. The words were strange and powerful, filling the room with an otherworldly energy. Nora closed her eyes and tried to focus, but her fear grew with every passing second. Then, an hour later, the prophetess brought out a thick rope. She walked toward Nora and began tying her hands together tightly. Nora's heart pounded in her chest. Why are you tying my hands? She asked, her voice shaking. Strong, child, the prophetess said, her tone calm but firm. This is the only way to drive the spirits away. The prophetess pulled out 3 large sticks and raised them high. With a loud crack, the first strike landed on Nora's back. Nora gasped in pain, tears springing to her eyes. "Why are you doing this?" she cried out. "Be strong," the prophetess repeated. "This pain will set you free. It's the only way to break the hold of the spirits." The beating continued, each strike sharper and heavier. Nora sobbed, her tears streaming down her face, but she didn't resist. She closed her eyes tightly, praying that this would be the end of her suffering. With every strike, she whispered silently, "God, please let this be the last time." When morning came, Agnes and John arrived at the prayer house carrying everything they had been told to bring: baby clothes, salt, and an old family photograph. The moment John saw Nora, his heart broke. Her body was bruised, her face pale and her eyes filled with pain. He ran to her, holding her tightly. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his voice trembling with anger and heartbreak. He looked down and saw the red, swollen marks on her back and arms. Tears filled his eyes as he held her close. Nora took a deep breath, her voice barely a whisper. "It's over now," she said, trying to reassure him. The prophetess walked into the room carrying a small waist bead. She handed it to Nora and said, "Wear this on your waist and never remove it. With this, no witchcraft can harm you again. There will be no more loss of pregnancy." Nora and John left the prayer house that afternoon, their hearts heavy but hopeful. As they traveled back to the city, they clung to the hope that their nightmare was finally over. But deep down, something didn't feel right. Late that night, John sat up beside Nora, pressing a warm towel against her bruised back. The room was quiet except for their breathing and the occasional hiss of the hot water. "Baby," John said softly, breaking the silence, "do you really think this prophetess is real?" Nora winced as the towel pressed against a sore spot. "Yes, John, she is real. My stepmom took me to her before, and it was after that visit that I conceived for the first time. I didn't want to tell you before because I was desperate. I needed answers." John paused, his brow furrowed. "Something feels off about that place. I can't explain it, but it doesn't sit right with me." Nora didn't reply immediately. She stared at the wall, her mind replaying the events of the night before. The beating, the prayers, the strange energy in the room, it all felt like a distant dream. But as the clock ticked on, a shadow of doubt crept into her heart. Was the nightmare really over? Or had it only just begun? 2 months after her last miscarriage, Nora discovered she was pregnant again. The joy was indescribable. She rushed to tell her husband John, with tears in her eyes. "I told you the prophetess is real!" she exclaimed, her voice trembling with excitement. "Her prayers are working. Her church is growing so fast because of the good work she does in God's name." John hugged her tightly, relieved but still cautious. "Let's keep praying," he said softly, though a part of him remained uneasy. The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Nora glowed with happiness, and every visit to the doctor confirmed that the baby was healthy. They began preparing for their long-awaited child. Everything felt perfect until the pregnancy clocked exactly 20 weeks. That night, Nora drifted off to sleep. In her dream, she found herself in the same dreadful scene as before. She was lying on the cold restroom floor, her legs wide open. Her stepmother, Agatha, stood over her again, pulling babies out of her womb and flushing them down the toilet. Nora screamed in agony, begging her to stop, but Agatha didn't listen. She woke up with a jolt, her heart pounding like a drum. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she noticed her bedsheet soaked with blood. "No!" she cried out, her voice breaking. "Not again!" John rushed to her side, panic written all over his face. He scooped her up and rushed her to the hospital, but the worst had already happened. The doctors confirmed she had miscarried. From that day on, it became a heartbreaking cycle. Nora would conceive, and exactly at 20 weeks, she would lose the pregnancy. They visited the best hospitals in the country, but every doctor said the same thing. There was nothing physically wrong with her. Nora's stepmother, Agatha, kept encouraging her. "My child, have faith and stay close to Prophetess Thunder. She's a great woman of God. You heard my story. Before your father married your mother, I was barren for 18 years. But when I met Prophetess Thunder, everything changed. In 2 years, I gave birth to your stepsisters. Hold on to her. We will win this battle. For 2 years, Nora continued to miscarry every pregnancy at 20 weeks. The constant loss broke her spirit. She became a shadow of herself, and one night she couldn't hold it in any longer. She woke her husband, tears streaming down her face. "John, it's clear now," she said, her voice trembling. "God doesn't want us to have children. I've seen so many women visit Prophetess Thunder and carry their children, even my friend Adura. Maybe I'm meant to live and die without a child, but you, my love, don't deserve this. I can't let you be part of my misfortune." John shook his head, his voice firm. "No, Nora, we will go through this together. God will bless us with our own children." Nora looked at him with pleading eyes. "John, I've already spoken to Agatha. You should marry my stepsister Terry. She will give us children. Please do this for me." John jumped out of bed, his voice filled with disbelief. "God forbid!" he shouted. "How can you even suggest such a thing?" "Please, John," Nora begged, holding his hand. "It's the only way. At least she's my sister and we can be one happy family." But John refused, his heart heavy with sadness and anger. Late one night, John sat alone, his mind racing. "God, I know you will not forsake me," he whispered. "The time is now." The next morning, he packed a bag and told Nora, "I have an urgent business meeting. I'll be back in 3 days." Though worried, Nora nodded. "Safe trip, my love." John drove for hours until he reached the old, crumbling house where he had grown up, the place where his parents were buried. The house stood alone in a desolate field, surrounded by silence and memories. He stripped himself naked and knelt on the cold floor. "God, show me the root of our problems," he prayed, tears streaming down his face. He cried, fasted, and prayed for 3 days straight. On the final night, as he lay exhausted, he heard a clear voice. "Remove the waist bead and set it ablaze on the day the pregnancy clocks 20 weeks. John sat up, startled. At first he thought he had imagined it, but the instruction grew stronger in his spirit. Back home, John convinced Nora to try again. Reluctantly, she agreed, and soon she was pregnant once more. During the pregnancy, Nora was placed on strict bed rest, but she continued to visit Prophetess Thunder secretly, against John's wishes. When the pregnancy reached 20 weeks, Nora grew terrified. That night, she sat up in bed with John, clutching her stomach. "Honey, let's stay awake tonight," she said. "I want to see the demon that comes to take my child." John nodded, though he had his own plans. He gently mixed a sleeping pill into her drink. "Drink this, my love," he said. "It'll help you relax." Nora hesitated, but drank it anyway. Moments later, her eyelids grew heavy, and she drifted off to sleep, unaware of what John had planned next. Late that night, while Nora slept peacefully, John quietly removed the waist bead from her waist. His hands trembled as he held the thin string, knowing this was no ordinary piece of jewelry. He walked into his small prayer room, clutching it tightly, and knelt on the floor. "Lord, I don't know what's happening, but I trust you," he whispered. He lit a small fire in a clay pot and threw the waist bead into the flames. As the fire consumed it, John's prayers grew louder, tears streaming down his face. "Whatever power has held us captive, let it end tonight," he cried, his voice echoing through the room. John stayed awake all night, his eyes fixed on his wife, who slept deeply, unaware of what was happening. Across town, in her small bedroom, Mrs. Agatha was jolted awake by the sharp ring of her phone. She fumbled in the dark and picked it up. "Leave everything you are doing and come to the church immediately," the voice on the other end shouted in panic. "What's wrong?" Agatha asked, her heart pounding. "There's a problem. Just come." Without hesitation, Agatha grabbed her purse and rushed to Prophetess Thunder's church. When she arrived, she found the prophetess pacing the room, her face pale and furious. Candles flickered around the dark room, casting eerie shadows on the walls. "I warned you!" Prophetess Thunder shouted the moment she saw Agatha. "I've been trying to invoke Nora, but it's not working." "What do you mean?" Agatha asked, her voice trembling. "She removed the waist bead," the prophetess snapped. Agatha gasped. "That's not possible! I made her promise never to take it off!" The two women stared at each other, fear gripping their hearts. The prophetess slammed her hands on the table, her voice filled with desperation. "Without the bead, I can't reach her. If we don't sacrifice her baby before 6 a.m., the spell will backfire. I will die, and you—" She pointed a trembling finger at Agatha. "You will confess everything or run mad." Agatha shook her head, her knees wobbling. "I told you we should have left her alone. You insisted she get pregnant so you could use the babies for rituals to grow your church. Now look where it has gotten us." "This is not the time to pass blame," Prophetess Thunder screamed, her voice sharp with panic. "We need to act fast. If we don't, we are finished." They spent the next hour chanting and trying every spell they could think of, but nothing worked. Each passing minute felt like a noose tightening around their necks. By 4:15 a.m., their panic had reached its peak. Prophetess Thunder grabbed Agatha by the shoulders, her eyes wild. "The only option left is to bring her here before 6 a.m. "But how?" Agatha asked, her voice breaking. "It's the middle of the night. I can't just call her and ask her to come here now. She lives 35 minutes away. By the time she gets here, it will be too late." The prophetess slammed her fist on the table. "Then go to her. Whatever it takes, you must bring her here before sunrise. If you fail, I'll die and you'll consequences alone." Agatha hesitated for a moment, then picked up her phone and began dialing Nora's number. The line rang, but there was no answer. She tried again and again, but the number was switched off. "She's not picking up," Agatha stammered, her hands shaking. "Then get into the car and go to her house," Prophetess Thunder ordered. "There's no time to waste." Agatha nodded reluctantly. The prophetess's driver pulled up the car and Agatha climbed in. "Drive as fast as you can," she urged, her voice filled with desperation. As the car sped through the dark, empty streets, Agatha couldn't stop the tears from falling. "What have I gotten myself into?" she whispered to herself. The closer they got to Nora's house, the heavier her heart felt. Inside the house, John continued praying, his voice growing hoarse. Nora stirred slightly in her sleep but didn't wake. Unbeknownst to them, a storm was brewing outside, one that would change everything. The driver sped through the dark roads, pushing the car to its limits. The journey that should have taken 35 minutes was completed in 25, but for Mrs. Agatha, every second felt like an eternity. When they arrived at Nora's house, Mrs. Agatha didn't waste a moment. She banged on the door, her fist trembling as she knocked harder and harder. John opened the door, his face calm but wary. "My son-in-law," Mrs. Agatha began, her voice shaky, "the prophetess sent me. She said the evil spirit that takes the babies will be here soon. We need to take Nora to the church now to protect her." John stood silently for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he finally spoke. "No, I'm here. I'll wait for that demon myself. Nora will not go anywhere." The tension in the air was thick. Mrs. Agatha's voice grew louder, her desperation showing. "John, why are you stopping her from being saved? Do you want this misfortune to continue, or is it because you are the one behind it all?" John's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, their raised voices woke Nora from her sleep. She stepped outside, rubbing her eyes, confused by the commotion. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice soft but concerned. Mrs. Agatha rushed to her. "My child, thank God you're here. The prophetess says you must come to the church immediately. We need to protect your baby from the evil spirit that's been taking them. I've been begging your husband, but he refuses. Now I know he has a hand in all of this." Nora froze, her heart racing. She turned to John, her voice trembling. "John, why would you do such a thing? Why are you stopping me from protecting our child? Have we not suffered enough?" John's voice was firm but calm. "You are not going anywhere, Nora." But Nora was already slipping on her slippers, determined to leave. "I must go. I have to protect my child." John's voice boomed, his words cutting through the night. "If you step out of this house, this marriage is over." Nora stopped in her tracks, her breath hitching. Tears streamed down her face as she turned to face John. Her heart was torn between her husband, who had stood by her through years of heartbreak, and the safety of her unborn child. Mrs. Agatha, seeing the hesitation, whispered urgently, "Nora, you must think of your baby. Even if it means leaving John, you have to go." Nora stood still, speechless, as the seconds ticked by. Finally, she spoke, her voice filled with sorrow. "If this is how you want it, John, then so be it. But I will do whatever it takes to protect my child." She walked toward the car, her steps heavy, and got in, Mrs. Agatha quickly followed, urging the driver to start the car, but just as they were about to drive off, Nora called out, "Stop the car!" The driver hit the brakes, and Nora stepped out. She walked slowly back toward John, her face streaked with tears. "I love you, John. You've stood by me through everything. I don't want to believe you could ever harm me or our children. I'll stay, but if anything happens to this baby, I will never forgive you." John's eyes filled with tears as he nodded silently. Mrs. Agatha ran after her. "Nora, no! You must come with me. It's almost time." Nora turned to her. "Big Mummy, go home. I'm staying here." A chill ran down Mrs. Agatha's spine. "No, no, no," she cried, desperation creeping into her voice. "You don't understand. You have to come with me." Her behavior made Nora pause. "Why does she want me to come so badly?" Nora thought to herself, suspicion growing in her mind. The clock struck 5:45 a.m. With just 15 minutes left, Mrs. Agatha grew frantic. Her hands shook, her breathing quickened, and then suddenly she dropped to her knees. "Please, I'll confess!" Nora and John exchanged a shocked glance before stepping closer. "Confess what?" they asked in unison. Mrs. Agatha sobbed uncontrollably, her voice barely audible. "It was me! All these years! I was jealous of Mama Nora! She took—"
Thank you so much for watching till this time. If you have stayed tuned, please do well to press on the subscribe button and also do well to press on the notification bell so that you are aware when next I'll be posting my next videos. To all you my subscribers, you know I love you. Until next time, bye-bye.